She thought he was just another forgotten creature, ragged fur, lonely eyes, the kind of stray you see once, feed once, and then forget. But the moment she offered him that first bite of food, the world shifted, and she unknowingly stepped into a story far larger, far stranger, and far more extraordinary than anything she had ever known. Every afternoon, as the city exhaled the last tension of the working day, and allowed its streets to fall into that peculiar stillness that exists only in the soft light between school bells and supper tables, a young girl named Lily would make her way home with the quiet, determined steps of someone who had learned, far earlier than she should have, the value of staying invisible in a world too busy, too distracted, and too loud to notice a child who kept her head down and her voice small. Her walk followed the same familiar route each day, past the bakery where the scent of cinnamon clung to the sidewalk like a promise she could never afford to taste, past the old bookstore that had, past the corner where street performers once played but now sat silent, replaced by nothing at all, and then finally, always, through the narrow alley behind her building where the concrete was cracked, the shadows fell early, and the world seemed, if only for a moment, to forget itself entirely. It was there, in that overlooked strip of quiet, where the walls whispered of rain and rust, that she first saw him, curled against the dumpster, silent and still, a dog with fur the color of riverbanks after a storm, and eyes that did not plead or panic, but held her gaze with the kind of patient, unwavering clarity that makes you feel seen, not as you appear, but as you are beneath the noise and the armor. She didn't speak, she didn't move, but something in her, something small and soft that had survived the bruises of a life lived half listened to, reached into her backpack and pulled out the half sandwich she had saved. Not for Ennio. She crouched, extended her arm slowly, and placed the food a few feet away, not expecting gratitude, not expecting anything at all, except perhaps the flicker of recognition between two beings who knew what it meant to be overlooked. What Lily didn't know, what she could never have imagined in that moment of simple, silent grace, was that this dog, ragged and quiet and still, was not what he appeared to be, and that the path she had just stepped onto would lead her straight into the life of a man whose wealth could reshape skylines, but whose soul had been searching, endlessly, for something far more valuable to be found. In the days that followed that first encounter, a moment so brief and unremarkable to any passing eye, yet so quietly transformative in the heart of a girl who had spent most of her life watching not because she felt obligated, and not because she thought of it as a mission or a chore, but because something inside her, something she couldn't quite name, felt drawn to that quiet presence with fur like wintered soil and eyes that never begged, never flinched, and never asked for more than exactly what was given. The dog, whom she had not yet dared to name, never barked, never whimpered, never moved first. He would simply wait, motionless, but never tense, his body curled with the stillness of something meet her eyes without challenge or fear, and only then, only when she had knelt and offered her hand or her sandwich or the crusts of whatever meal she'd salvaged, would he rise and approach, moving with the deliberate grace of a creature who had known both trust and betrayal, and had learned to accept kindness only when it came quietly. Lily began to speak to him, not in full sentences at first, not in any way that suggested conversation, but in fragments of thought spoken aloud to no one in particular, the way a child might whisper. Her voice steadier, until the alley behind her building became not just a shortcut or a hiding place, but a sanctuary, a space where she was no longer invisible, because someone, even if he could not speak, was listening. She told him about school, about the teacher who scolded her for daydreaming, about the girl with perfect hair who made fun of her shoes, about the boy who pushed her books off her desk and laughed when she bent to pick them up. And though the dog said nothing in return, though his only response was the steady gaze of someone who would not look away, Lily felt something shift in her, like a window cracked open in a room that had grown stale, letting in air she hadn't realized she needed. She noticed things about him too, how his fur, though tangled, was clean in patches, as if someone had once brushed it carefully, how his collar, though missing, had left a faint line of smoother hair around his neck, how he flinched, ever so slightly, at the sound of certain engines or the echo of footsteps on wet pavement, but never at her, never at her voice, never at the trembling of her hands when she told him things she had never said aloud before. And then on the 6th day, something changed. As she rounded the corner, the familiar weight of a plastic sandwich bag in her palm, she saw him already waiting, but not alone. A man stood at the edge of the alley, too far to touch but close enough to see, dressed in a dark overcoat that looked far too expensive for this part of town, holding a phone to his ear and watchy. Something calculating, and when he noticed her, when their eyes met for the briefest second, he turned sharply, spoke into the phone with an urgency she could feel but not hear, and then walked away without a word. The dog hadn't moved, but Lily had. She stepped closer that day, not just physically but emotionally, instinctively, feeling something inside her tighten, not with fear, but with a protective certainty she had never known before, and, closer than ever before, he leaned into her gently, resting his head against her knee in a way that made her forget the cold, the alley, the shadows, everything except the quiet miracle of being chosen, even if only for that moment. She didn't know who that man was. She didn't know why he had been watching. But something in her, something as old as intuition, as deep as memory, told her that this wasn't just a stray dog, and she had just stepped into something far more complicated than a daily act of kindness. That evening, long after she had returned home and the weight of her school bag had been exchanged for the heavier quiet of her small bedroom overlooking the alley, Lily sat by the window with her Nain. And though the day had ended much like all the others, with dinner eaten in silence, homework half finished, her mother already asleep in the other room from another shift worked too hard and too long, there was something different stirring in her chest now, something restless and uncertain, something that pulsed beneath her ribs like a question that hadn't found its words yet. She replayed the moment over and over, the man in the coat, the brief glance, the hurried call, the way he had disappeared as quickly as he'd come, and the more she thought about it, the more she Not entirely, not if someone like him had found it. And as she watched the shadows stretch across the brick walls below, she couldn't shake the feeling that a door had been opened somewhere, silently, and that someone, had now stepped through it. The next day, she returned as always, the sandwich in her backpack slightly squished from the weight of her books, her heart pounding a little faster than usual as she neared the alley. Not because she feared the dog wouldn't be there, but because she feared he would, and that something about the world they had created in that narrow, forgotten place might no longer belong to just the two of them. But when she turned the corner, there he was, sitting exactly where he always did, the same calm posture, the same watchful eyes, as though nothing had changed at all, and the relief that flooded her chest made her exhale more deeply than she realized, her shoulders sinking just slightly as she knelt and reached into her bag. Yet this time, as he ate, she noticed something new. Around his neck, tucked beneath the thick mat of fur she hadn't dared to touch before, was a faint shimmer, metallic, golden, dulled by grime, but unmistakable. And when she leaned closer, carefulness. Not the kind with numbers and rabies certifications, but a small pawn engraved piece shaped like a medallion, ornate and heavy-looking, the kind of thing you didn't buy at a pet store but had designed. And though most of the surface had been scratched or worn, a single letter remained visible at its center, V. She didn't touch it. She didn't have to, because the moment her eyes fixed on it, the dog lifted his head and looked at her. Not with confusion, not with fear, but with the kind of steady awareness that made her feel, just for a second, like he was the one trying to figure her out, as though he'd been waiting to see when she would finally notice. And before she could say anything, before she could ask aloud the questions already stacking themselves behind her teeth, he did something he had never done before. He stood up fully, turned and began to walk, slowly at first, deliberately, as though checking to see if she would follow. And when she hesitated, heart racing, he stopped, looked back once, and gave a single, brief wag of his tail, not excited, not urgent, just certain. So she followed. Through the alley, across the side street, down a narrow set of stairs she had never noticed before, her sneakers barely making a sound against the damp concrete, her breath held without meaning to, and finally out into a small courtyard nestled between buildings, where vines climbed the walls like veins, and a single bench sat beneath a rusted lamppost that flickered weakly against the grey sky. The dog stopped at the bench, sat and waited, and that's when she saw it. Etched into the stone wall behind the bench, mostly obscured by ivy, was a plaque. She brushed the leaves aside, and there, in brass letters dulled by years of rain and smog, were the words, "In memory of Victor, friend, protector, and the heart of home." She stared at the name, Victor, V, the medallion. And suddenly, the image of the man in the dark coat came back with startling clarity. Not just his face, but the look in his eyes when he saw the dog, a look not of curiosity, but of recognition. She sat down on the bench slowly, her fingers still resting on the plaque, and whispered the name aloud, Victor. The dog looked up, and for the first time, truly and unmistakably, he smiled. That night, Lily lay awake far longer than usual, her body curled beneath the same patchwork blanket she had used since she was little. The sounds of the city humming dimly beyond her window like same gentle creak of the radiator tapping out its irregular lullaby. Something in her had shifted so completely, so irrevocably, that even the quiet felt different now, not empty, not distant, but charged with meaning, as if every breath of wind outside was carrying with it a piece of a story she had only just begun to understand. She couldn't stop thinking about the plaque, about the name, about the way the dog Victor, she could say it now, say it with certainty, had led her there not by accident, but by memory, by something far deeper than instinct, and the way he had looked at her had made her feel not like a rescuer or a child or even a friend, but like someone who had been chosen, someone who had stepped unknowingly into the center of a life that had, until now, been scattered across sidewalks, alleyways, and unanswered questions. She wondered, for the first time, who had placed that plaque, why it had been hidden behind ivy, and how a dog like Victor, clearly intelligent, clearly trained, clearly once loved beyond words, had ended up forgotten in the back alley of a city that never looked down long enough to notice what it was trampling beneath its feet. And she couldn't shake the memory of the man in the coat. His presence no longer felt like a coincidence. It felt like the beginning of something. The next day, driven by a feeling she couldn't quite name, Lily returned to the courtyard, not with food this time, but with a notebook, a pencil, and the kind of determination that only a young person can carry without apology. The kind born from the moment you realize the world is holding onto a secret and that somehow you've been given a piece of it. Victor was there before her, as though he had known she would come, his posture calm, his eyes bright, and when she sat beside him and opened her notebook, she began writing down every detail the route they had taken, the shape of the medallion, the wording on the plaque. And as she wrote, Victor rested his head on her foot, his breath steady, as if he understood that this was no longer about food or shelter, but about truth. Over the next week, the pattern deepened. Every day after school, Lily returned to the courtyard, and every day Victor met her there. Together, they traced paths through back streets and alleys, past buildings with names she began to sketch down, past murals faded with time, past wrought-iron fences that seemed too elegant for they. Victor stopped in front of a building unlike any they had seen before, a tall black glass tower framed by a marble entrance and guarded by silence, the kind of building that didn't welcome visitors so much as tolerate them, the kind that whispered importance through its refusal to explain itself. Victor didn't bark, he didn't whimper, he simply sat and looked up, and when Lily followed his gaze, she saw, etched into the smooth white stone above the doors in letters that shimmered faintly against the darkening sky, the name V. Lancaster Holdings. She said the words aloud, softly. Victor's ears twitched. The thunder rolled low in the distance. It didn't make sense at first. Nothing about the cold steel of that tower connected with the soft-eyed dog who had become her world. But then she remembered something from a television playing in the bay. A man so private that only a handful of photos of him existed, whose empire stretched across continents, whose wealth was spoken about in terms too vast to grasp, and whose only known scandal, ever so briefly whispered before being buried by PR teams and lawyers, had been a missing dog. Unconfirmed, unexplained, never spoken of again. Lily stepped back from the door, The rain had begun to fall now, softly at first, then in heavier drops that painted the pavement in uneven circles, and Victor stood beside her, silent, steady, as if waiting for her to decide what came next. She looked at him, looked at the tower, and for the first time, her heart didn't race with fear but with wonder. Because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a story about a girl who found a dog. Maybe this was a story about a dog who found his way back. In the days that followed their silent revelation before the towering glass building that bore the Lancaster name, Lily found herself moving through the world with a heightened awareness that did not, responsibility and a sense of inevitability, as though the pieces of a story long buried were now quietly, inexorably assembling themselves beneath her feet, even as the people around her continued living their lives, unaware that something forgotten had begun to stir back into motion. Each morning she awoke not only with thoughts of school and chores, but with the lingering imprint of Victor's gaze, the way he had sat beneath that gleaming entrance, unmoving, his head tilted sliggle. And it was that image, more than the plaque or the medallion or even the strange man in the coat, that stayed with her, that pressed gently against her heart like a finger, tracing the outline of something long faded, but never quite erased. She began to see the city differently, not as the place where she had grown up, with its alleys and streetlights and voices that never called her name, but as a vast and layered map filled with paths, impossibly close, waiting just beneath the surface of the ordinary, ready to be found not through force or luck but through persistence, attention, and the quiet certainty of someone who knows they are walking towards something that matters. Victor, too, seemed to sense this shift, not in his behavior, which remained calm and measured, but in the way he moved through space with her, never leading too far ahead, never hesitating when she paused to take notes or sketch the places they passed, always remaining just close enough that she could feel his presence without ever needing to look, like a shadow made of memory and intention rather than light. When she began writing things down, details about the buildings they passed, the way the sunlight struck certain windows at certain hours, the names etched onto brass plaques and mailboxes, they were for the story that was beginning to build around her. A story she hadn't asked to be part of, but now felt bound to carry, not because she believed she was the only one who could tell it, but because she feared what would happen if no one did. And yet, beneath all this movement and note-taking and observation, a single question kept circling the edge of her thoughts, returning each night like a whisper just before sleep. Why had no one come for him? If Victor had once belonged to Vincent Lancaster, a man powerful enough to disappear stories, to bury scandals beneath money and time, why had his dog ended up in the alley behind Lily's apartment, thin and alone, without collar or escort, or even a trace of being sought? She could not believe he had been forgotten, not with eyes like that, not with the training that still showed in the way he responded to sharp sounds, the way he sat when she stood still, the way he looked both ways before crossing a street as though remembering rules once drilled into him by someone who had cared. And so she searched, not loudly, not publicly, but with the quiet persistence of someone who has learned how to move through the world without attracting the kind of attention that asks too many questions, and what she found only deepened the mystery. A brief article buried in an old digital archive, a reward offered for information about a missing service dog connected to the Lancaster estate, last seen near the northern hills, believed stolen, never recovered. The search abruptly ended after a few weeks without explanation. The family declining interviews, the press moving on. No photos, no follow-ups, no closure, just a space where a story had been and then suddenly wasn't. Victor had been taken. That much was clear, but what remained hidden, what clung to Lily's thoughts like damp fog clings to windows, was who had taken him and why. Because if someone had gone to the trouble of removing a dog like Victor from a place like that, only to leave him in an alley months later, it wasn't just negligence, it was intentional. And that meant danger, not just for Victor, but maybe, now, for her. And yet, when she looked at him, lying at her feet as she pieced the clues together in her worn notebook, his breath steady, his eyes always tracking her with something that looked very much like. Not because she was brave, And not because she believed she could outsmart whatever force had made Victor disappear, but because something in her, something she hadn't known was there, had begun to grow each time he looked at her like she mattered. And once you've been seen that way, once you've been trusted like that, you don't walk away. Not even when the story grows dark. Especially then. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of overcast, wind-brushed day that made the city feel both quieter and more watchful, when Lily first noticed the car, a sleek, low black sedan that didn't be, as though even the weight of its movement had been engineered not to leave a mark. And although it hadn't followed her directly, although she hadn't seen it pull up or drive away, it was there again, parked across the street from the small grocery where she sometimes stopped for bread, always facing the alley, always empty, or at least appearing to be. At first, she told herself it was nothing, that she was being paranoid, that cities were full of strangers, that rich men like Vincent Lancaster probably had drivers and bodyguards and surveillance. But the part of her that had been shaped by years of moving carefully, of learning how to read people's tones before their words and their eyes before their mouths, knew the difference between coincidence and intent. And this was no accident. Victor noticed it too. She could tell by the way his ears tilted when they passed it, the way his body shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, placing himself between her and the street, never aggressive, never reactive, but quietly ready, as if the instincts he'd once been trained to obey were beginning to stir beneath the soft weight of their time together, like muscle memory waiting for permission to activate again. And that was when she realized she wasn't the only one following breadcrumbs. Someone else had started watching her, and whoever it was, they weren't trying very hard to stay hidden. They wanted her to know. But why? The question gnawed at her in the hours between school and sleep, as she replayed each interaction, each place they'd visited, each trace of the name Lancaster left behind in the architecture of the... And the more she looked, the more she saw how deeply this man's reach extended, how many doors bore his silent fingerprints, how thoroughly he had managed to insulate himself from the world with layers of image and influence. But somewhere inside all that structure, somewhere beneath the tailored suits and the guarded press statements and the palace of silence he had built around his life, there had been room for a dog named Victor, a companion, not a trophy, someone who had mattered. And if that connection had once been real, then the silence that followed Victor's disappearance could only mean one of two things. Either something had happened that Vincent Lancaster couldn't speak of, or something had happened that he chose not to. Both possibilities carried danger, but one of them carried guilt. And guilt had a way of seeping through cracks, no matter how thick the wall. So Lily decided to find the crack. She started small, asking a question at the library that made the attendant raise an eyebrow but say nothing, emailing an address she found buried in the contact page of the Lancaster Foundation's web, phrasing her message as a polite inquiry about animal welfare initiatives and whether any programs had been discontinued recently, trying to sound curious rather than probing. But it was what happened the next day that truly told her she had been heard. Waiting for her at the bench in the courtyard, tucked carefully beneath a stone she had once used to weigh down a page of her notes, was an envelope, plain, sealed, with no name or return address, and inside, a single folded piece of paper with just 4 words typed across the center. "You're asking the wrong question." No signature. No explanation. Just that. And yet those words hit harder than any threat could have, because they carried implication, not denial, not dismissal, but redirection, as though someone out there, someone watching, someone listening, had chosen not to stop her, but to guide her. Which meant, somehow, that this was bigger than her, bigger than Victor, and maybe even bigger than Lancaster himself. She didn't show the note to anyone. She didn't speak of it aloud. But as she sat beside Victor that evening, her fingers brushing the worn fur behind his ears, her mind spinning with possibilities and doubts, and a strange, growing sense that she had already crossed a line she could no longer retreat from, she whispered something she hadn't said before, not to herself and not even to him. "I don't know who I'm becoming in all this," she said softly, "but I think I have to find out." Victor didn't move, but he didn't look away either. And sometimes, that's all the answer you need. Ever since she had found the note, Those 4 enigmatic words printed cleanly on a piece of paper that bore no name, no address, no hint of origin, yet carried with it the unmistakable gravity of in. Each motion slightly slowed by the weight of the unknown, her thoughts never quite her own, each silence now filled with the hum of possibility, each moment of stillness haunted by the suspicion that she was no longer just a girl following clues, but someone being quietly and precisely observed. She kept the note hidden beneath her mattress, not because she thought anyone would come looking for it, but because its presence above ground made her feel watched in a way even more acute than the... And each time her fingertips brushed its folded edge while making her bed or reaching for a dropped pencil, she felt again the slow tightening of something around her life, something invisible, deliberate, and growing steadily more difficult to ignore. There was no message of threat in those 4 words, no overt warning or attempt to frighten her away, but somehow the absence of menace made the note feel more serious, more dangerous, as if whoever had placed it beneath that stone knew that Lily wasn't the type of girl to back away from something just because it got heavy in her hands. She tried for a few days to pretend that things hadn't changed, to follow her routine, to walk Victor through the same alleys and past the same storefronts, to greet the same tired neighbors, and her awareness of everything had sharpened. She began noticing the patterns of people's footsteps, the repetition in car horns 2 blocks away, the subtle differences in Victor's breathing when they neared certain intersections, and most of all, the way her own thoughts had begun to move faster, more insistently, as if something inside her had been unlocked. She had never known what it felt like to be necessary. She had spent much of her life being overlooked by teachers, by peers, sometimes even by her own mother, whose exhaustion often filled their apartment more completely than her voice. But now, she found herself filled with a kind of urgency that wasn't born from danger or fear, but from a need to matter, to follow this thread not for the thrill of it, but because she was beginning to believe that she might be the only one who could. Victor never asked anything of her. He never pulled on the leash, never wandered, never made her feel unsafe, but he was watching too. And the more time she spent beside him, the more she understood that this was not just about a lost pet, and not even about the man who had once owned him, but about something larger and far less defined, something broken that someone somewhere had tried very hard to hide beneath money, silence, and distance. Late one night, unable to sleep, her chest too tight with questions that had no language, she found herself sitting on the fire escape just outside her bedroom window, her legs pulled close. Vict. And the city laid out before them like a machine she'd only just begun to understand. A system of lights and walls and names that had all seemed permanent and indifferent until now, when she was beginning to see how fragile it all really was. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do next," she whispered into the dark, her voice swallowed by the wind, not expecting an answer, not even needing one, but needing, at the very least, to admit that whatever innocence had once shielded her from the weight of consequence was now gone, replaced by the slow, steady realization that knowledge, once found, cannot be forgotten. Victor didn't move. He didn't blink, but his body pressed just slightly closer, and in that gesture, Lily felt the echo of a vow, not one made in words, but in presence, in loyalty, in that quiet, animal way of saying, "Whatever comes, I stay." And in that moment, she knew the decision had already been made, not in some sudden burst of courage, but in 100 smaller moments, each step taken, each page written, each quiet instinct followed without knowing why, and that now, what remained was not to decide whether she would act, but how, and whether she could do so before the story swallowed her whole. It began with a photograph, worn at the edges, slightly warped from moisture, and tucked between 2 loose pages in an old, donated biography that Lily had pulled from the library's free take bis. Drawn to the faded spine and dusty cover with a tug of curiosity she couldn't explain, and the moment she flipped it open and saw the image fall into her lap, her breath caught not in surprise, but in the quiet, sharp recognition of something she hadn't known she was waiting to find. The photo, slightly yellowed and printed on thick paper that suggested it had not been made recently, showed a man standing beside a younger version of Victor, his fur brighter then, his body lean. But like someone touching something irreplaceable, a gesture not of ownership, but of connection. And though the man's face was partially turned away, there was no mistaking who it was. Vincent Lancaster, in a moment of unguarded affection the world had never been allowed to see. Lily stared at the photograph for several minutes, her fingers trembling just enough to blur the edges, her heart pounding not with fear, but with the strange, swelling sensation of a puzzle snapping. Not in finality, but in confirmation that what she had felt from the beginning, the depth of Victor's loss, the echo of betrayal beneath his calm, the way he sometimes seemed to remember places she'd never seen, wasn't a guess or projection, but real, solid, and now documented. And yet, more striking than the proof itself was the question it brought screaming back to the surface. Why, if this man had once loved this dog, had once knelt beside him, had once allowed a photograph like this to exist, had he let him go, let him vanish, let the world believe he was gone without rage, without search, without a trace? It was this question that began to haunt her most, curling itself around her thoughts during classes, during meals, even in her sleep, which had grown restless, filled with dreams that felt more. A door closing behind him, and then the quiet, the long quiet and the cold. And each time she woke, she felt more certain that whatever had happened to Victor hadn't been an accident, hadn't been random, hadn't been merely the result of negligence or loss. Something had been done, and now someone wanted it undone. The next clue came not from research or surveillance, but from a voice, low, calm, almost amused, that greeted her as she exited the library 2 days later, arms full of books, Victor walking slightly ahead, when a man stepped from behind the pillar near the gate and said, without preamble, "You've been asking good questions." The kind that make the right people nervous. She stopped instantly, her entire body locking in a kind of internal recoil, not out of immediate fear, but in the way someone freezes when they realize the script they were writing in private has suddenly been read aloud. The man was tall, unshaven, wearing a coat that didn't quite fit his frame, and dark-rimmed glasses that reflected the low afternoon light just enough to obscure his eyes. And though his posture was relaxed, his tone was too careful, too precise. The voice of someone who spoke only after rehearsing each word twice in his head. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, holding up one hand as if warding off panic that hadn't yet arrived. "And I'm not here to stop you either, but I think it's time you stopped playing detective alone." She didn't respond, didn't step forward, didn't run, just stood there, hands tightening around the straps of her backpack. Victor silent at her side but alert, his body perfectly still in the way only a dog trained to react at a single command can be. "I worked for him once," the man said, gesturing vaguely toward the skyline, where the Lancaster Tower shimmered faintly in the distance like a blade against the clouds. "A long time ago, before things got sanitized." He pulled something from his pocket then, a USB drive wrapped in a folded slip of paper, and held it out to her without moving closer. "I don't have time to explain everything," he said, glancing over his shoulder once before turning back. "But if you really want to understand what happened, if you want to know what they buried, this will help." Still, she didn't move. She didn't have to. Because Victor did. Just a single step forward, not aggressive, not warning, but assessing. And in that instant, the man knelt, placed the drive on the sidewalk, stood, and walked away without another word, disappearing around the corner as quickly and quietly as he had come. Lily stared at the object for what felt like hours, though it was likely only seconds, the world around her holding its breath as she bent to retrieve it, the paper crackling softly in her hand, the city resuming its rhythm only after she tucked the drive into her coat pocket and whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "We're not invisible anymore." And for the first time, Victor licked her hand. That night, long after the windows of the neighborhood had gone dark one by one, and the soft murmur of the city had faded into the deep, humming quiet reserved only for those who remain awake not. Victor curled at her side like a living shadow, while the USB drive, small, silent, and faintly metallic, rested on the closed lid of her notebook, radiating a presence far heavier than its weight should allow, as if the information it contained had already begun to change the air in the room. She hadn't opened it yet, not because she was afraid of what she might find, but because there was something sacred about the pause before discovery. A breath that held the tension of everything and she wanted to feel the full gravity of the moment, to acknowledge that once she crossed this threshold, there would be no turning back, no pretending she was simply a girl helping a lost dog, no retreat into the safety of not knowing. Outside, the wind moved softly through the narrow streets, brushing against window panes and rattling loose shutters, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a sound that once might have drawn her attention, but now barely registered beneath the steady drum of her thoughts, all circling the same questions. Who had sent the man, how much he knew, and why, after all this time, someone had chosen her to be the one to receive what had been hidden for so long. When she finally connected the drive to the old laptop her mother used for work, a machine slow to wake and groaning with age, the files loaded with a flickering uncertainty that mirrored her own, and, without ceremony, a folder opened to reveal a collection of documents, images, and video files, each labeled with the kind of clinical specificity that spoke not of chaos, but of curation, of someone not just documenting, but preserving a truth that had once been too dangerous to reveal. She opened the first video, and for a moment her breath stopped. The footage was grainy, taken from what appeared to be a surveillance camera in a large room lined with glass walls and silver accents, and at the center of the frame stood Victor, younger, brighter. It was clear from Victor's posture, from the slight tremble in his legs and the way his gaze never left the man seated in the corner, that something was wrong, not overtly violent, not explosive, but quietly wrong in the way that power becomes when it is allowed to operate without question. She clicked through the files, reports, receipts, correspondence between names she didn't recognize but whose titles carried weight. Director of Operations, Private Security Liaison, Public Relations Strategist, and with each new piece, the story took on a sharper edge. No longer just a mystery about a dog, but a web of decisions, mistakes, and buried damage, all surrounding a single event referred to again and again in code. Incident A17. The more she read, the clearer it became that Victor hadn't simply wandered off, hadn't been lost or stolen by accident. He had been removed, quietly, strategically, after witnessing something he should not have seen, or perhaps after being used in something no one had expected him to survive. And when the fallout became too messy, too human, the choice had been made to erase not only the incident, but the witness. He was never supposed to come back, but he had, and now he had brought her with him. As dawn began to stretch pale light across the cracked paint of her bedroom walls, and the first sounds of morning stirred faintly in the hallway beyond her door, Lily closed the laptop slowly, and then turned toward Victor, who had not moved, who had simply waited, his eyes fixed on her with the steady calm of someone who had known all along what she would find, and who trusted her enough to carry it forward. She didn't speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because the bond between them no longer required words, and instead she reached out, resting her hand gently against the curve of his back, feeling the rise and fall of his breath beneath her palm, grounding herself in the rhythm of a life that had once been discarded, and now stood at the center of something far greater than either of them had chosen. And in that quiet, just before the world resumed its pace, she made a decision, not loud, not dramatic, but final, that she would not let this story end in silence, that she would not allow power and fear to erase what had been done, that she would find a way to speak even if no one was ready to listen. Because she was no longer afraid of what the truth would cost. She was only afraid of what would happen if no one dared to pay it. There comes a moment, inevitable in any story that pushes beyond the point of comfort, where everything that has been discovered, uncovered, feared, and carried in silence begins to press outward. That moment arrived on a windless Thursday afternoon, when the air felt unusually still, and every sound seemed just a fraction too loud, as though the world itself was bracing for something it couldn't yet name but knew, instinctively, was coming. She had spent the morning rereading the files, not to gather more information, but to absorb the weight of what she already knew, not just the evidence of deliberate erasure, the cold efficiency with her. The decisions made not by villains, but by people who wore suits, spoke softly, and signed contracts that reduced living beings to risks, to liabilities, to data points that needed to disappear before they became inconvenient. Victor, ever at her side, had grown quieter too, not out of fear, not because something had changed in his trust toward her, but because he, more than anyone, seemed to understand the shift in atmosphere, seemed to sense that the point of passive observation was ending, and that soon, far sooner than either of them were ready for, they would be forced to step out from behind the quiet and into a confrontation they could no longer delay. The trigger came not from the Lancaster building, not from the man in the coat, not even from the city's indifferent heartbeat, but from home, from the small, cracked apartment Lily had always known as her sanctuary, the one place left untouched by the story she had begun weaving through alleys and server logs, and it happened without drama, without noise, in the most dangerous way possible. It arrived through the mailbox. A letter, no return address, no stamp, just her name, first and last, typed in sharp black letters, as though someone wanted to be clear they knew exactly who she was, exactly where she lived, and exactly what she had been doing. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not threatening in content but devastating in implication. Because what it said was simple: this isn't your fight. Walk away. You're a child, not a soldier. There was no signature, no demand, no warning of consequence, but that absence, like the quiet between a scream and a sob, was what made it so effective, because it didn't try to scare her away with violence or spectacle. It tried to shame her into silence, to remind her of her powerlessness, to reduce her again to the girl who had once been invisible, who was meant to remain that way. But Lily was no longer invisible. She was seen. She had been chosen, not by the man in the glass tower, not by any shadowed figure pulling strings behind the scenes, but by Victor, who had placed his story in her hands without words, who had walked with her through every unknown corner, who had led her not toward safety, but toward meaning. And now, as she stared at the letter, her hands steady despite the tremble in her chest, she realized that she had crossed the final line, the one that separates curiosity from purpose. They knew who she was, and she no longer cared. That evening, she returned to the Lancaster building, not to confront, not to accuse, but to be seen, to let them know that she was still moving, still watching, still present, and she walked with. But straight down the main boulevard, in the open, in the light, through crowds of strangers who glanced at her and then looked away, never realizing they were passing a girl who had quietly pulled back the edge of a story meant to remain buried. She didn't stop in front of the entrance. She didn't need to, because the cameras saw her, and she knew they would report, and someone, somewhere, would have to make a decision, again, not just about her, but about what came next. Later that night, as she sat beside Victor on the rooftop beneath a sky so cloudless it felt unnatural, she spoke with a voice that didn't sound like hers, but like someone she had grown into without realizing. "They think this story is about them," she said. Not to him, not to the wind, but to the city itself. But it's not. It's about what happens when you leave someone behind and think the world will forget. Victor shifted slightly, pressing his head into her side, and in that moment, she knew they were no longer preparing for a confrontation. They were in it. There are points in every story, points that don't announce themselves with drama or warning, but arrive quietly with the inevitability of a tide returning to shore, when every thread, every question. And it was in this space between knowing and acting that Lily found herself as she stood at the kitchen counter, the folded municipal document still warm from her hand, her breath caught between the weight of what it meant and the still forming realization of what she now had no choice but to do. The paper, simple tan gray, bureaucratic, had no urgency in its appearance, no dramatic revelation in its tone, and yet it struck her with more force than any shouted accusation ever could, because it... But the brutal finality of the signature at the bottom, that stark, precise scrawl of a man who, in that moment, had stopped being a figure of mystery or myth or whispered speculation, and had become something far more devastating, someone who knew what he was doing and did it anyway. She read the name once, twice, 3 times. Not to confirm it, she had no doubt, but to absorb the truth of it, to let it sink past her skin and into the marrow of her resolve, because she understood. It was a story about choice, about betrayal, about what it means to look into the eyes of someone who trusts you completely and still decide that your silence is worth more than their life. And yet, even as the heat of that realization burned beneath her skin, there was another truth rising within her, quieter, colder, sharper, that the only thing left to do was confront it directly, but face to face. Not for closure and not for vengeance, but because stories like this do not end in shadows, and she had come too far, seen too much, learned the weight of truth too intimately to let this one be swallowed back into silence. She didn't tell her mother. She didn't speak to the man in the coat. She didn't try to warn or prepare or explain herself to anyone, because some decisions do not require approval, and some paths, once chosen, cannot be walked with anyone else. And so, with hands enclosed within a plain envelope along with the photo of him and Victor, the file showing his authorization of the removal order, and a sentence that carried no accusation, no anger, no threat, only a mirror. You once looked at him with love. What changed? No signature, no contact details, only the truth distilled to its purest form. She walked it to the edge of the Lancaster property herself, placed it in the mailbox with fingers that did not tremble, and walked away without looking back, because she knew, more clearly than she had known anything, that if there was anything left in that tower capable of listening, it would hear this. And if there wasn't, then nothing else she could say would ever make a difference. For 3 days, there was nothing. No car, no message, no change in the silent watchfulness of the streets. But on the 4th afternoon, as she returned from school with Victor beside her and the late sun slanting low across the buildings, she saw the envelope tucked beneath her door. White, unmarked, unmistakably deliberate. Inside a card. Inside the card a single line. Tomorrow 4 p.m. South entrance. No more, no less. And so, when the next day arrived, its hours long and strange, stretched by the quiet dread that lives in anticipation, she dressed without thinking, slipped the original documents into her bag, checked the photograph one last time, and placed her hand on Victor's back, feeling the warmth of him, the steadiness of his presence, the weight of everything they had carried together, and without a word, they left. Not as a girl and a dog, but as a story no longer willing to be forgotten. The walk toward the Lancaster building, taken in deliberate silence beneath the gathering clouds of a sky so densely overcast, it seemed to press against the tops of the glass towers like a lid holding. Felt less like a journey through the city she had always known, and more like a passage into another layer of the world entirely, one in which the weight of every step carried the echo of all the truths she had uncovered, all the questions she had asked, and all the silences she had learned to read like warnings carved into the wind. Victor walked beside her, not pulling, not hesitating, matching her pace with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that the place they were about to enter was more than a building, more tea. It was the center of the web, the place where every decision had been made, every document signed, every silence purchased, and now, for the first time, it would have to face the very thing it had tried so carefully to erase. She didn't look up as she approached the south entrance, didn't need to, didn't want to give the tower the satisfaction of witnessing her awe, because awe had no place in this moment, only purpose. A man whose crisp uniform and unreadable expression suggested he had seen far more than he ever spoke of, glanced at her, and then silently opened the glass door without a word. She knew the message had been received, and the meeting had not been granted as a courtesy, but as a response. Inside, the silence was thicker, denser than the city air outside, filled not with absence but with containment, like a chamber built to muffle every sound that might carry truth too far. And as she kept her eyes forward, her breath measured, her hand lightly brushing Victor's back not to reassure him, but to remind herself that this presence, this bond, this story, was real. They entered the room without introduction, an office house but not in any conventional sense, more a private sanctum carved from steel and restraint, where every line was clean, every object curated, emanated a presence so deeply composed it bordered on inhuman. Vincent Lancaster, tall, immaculately dressed in slate grey, with silver at his temples and eyes that did not narrow or harden when they met hers, but simply held. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched. And then, without gesture or welcome, he said, in a voice so smooth and practiced it seemed sculpted rather than spoken, "I wondered if you would actually come." She didn't answer with a greeting. She didn't smile. She reached into her bag, pulled out the folded document, the one with his signature at the bottom, the one that had tried to turn Victor into a problem to be erased, and placed it on the table between them, flattening it with one hand as Victor sat silently beside her, his eyes never leaving the man who had once called him his own. "I read your order," she said, voice steady, low, precise. "You didn't lose him. You sent him away." Lancaster looked at the paper, then at her, then, for a moment, at Victor. And something flickered in his gaze. Not remorse, not recognition, but something colder. Calculation cracking under the pressure of inevitability. "I protected him," he said finally, and though the words were soft, they rang through the room like stone against metal. From what was coming. From what they wanted to use him for. "But you let him go," she said, her voice not rising, not trembling, but carving through the air like a blade honed on truth, "and you never went back." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that could not be defended. And for the first time since she had begun this impossible story, she saw him, really saw him, not as the unreachable man in the glass tower, not as a symbol or a ghost or a figurehead, but as a person who had once loved something deeply and, when it became inconvenient, when it became dangerous, when it threatened to pull something real out from behind the wall he had built, chose to walk away. "You're not here for answers," he said at last, quieter now, almost human. "You're here to finish something." And she nodded, not as a threat, not as a gesture of defiance, but as acknowledgement. Because yes, that's exactly what she had come to do. There are moments in life, rare and absolute, when every breath taken, every choice made, every step, silent or defiant, taken toward the heart of a hidden truth, converge with such force that the we, and must inevitably, rupture outward, not as chaos but as clarity. And that was precisely the moment in which Lily now stood, not as a girl who had wandered too far into someone else's story, but as the only person who had carried the truth to the place where it could no longer be ignored. The room, with its walls of clean glass and stone, with its impossible quiet and its sterile precision, seemed to recoil under the force of her presence, not because she had power in the way men likes, something uncontainable by systems or signatures. She carried memory, she carried loyalty, she carried the living presence of a creature that the man before her had once chosen, once trusted, and then, at the pivotal moment, when it truly mattered, had erased from his life like an inconvenient sentence in a well-rehearsed speech. Victor did not move. He did not growl, did not bark, did not flinch. He sat perfectly still beside her, his body relaxed, his breath steady, and yet his gaze, locked on Lancaster's face, carried with it the full, unblinking weight of everything that had passed between them, everything that had once bound them, and everything that had been shattered when loyalty was met not with protection, but with silence. Lancaster, to his credit, did not look away, but his voice, when he spoke, no longer carried the smooth certainty of a man in control of the room. It cracked, almost imperceptibly, beneath the pressure of what had finally returned to him. "I tried to protect him," he said again, but softer this time, as if repeating the lie to himself now rang differently in the presence of the one who knew its shape too intimately to be fooled. "I had no choice," he continued, and Lily could see beneath the tailored jacket, behind the practiced stoicism, the first traces of something real, a man remembering the moment he turned away, and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that turning away had not removed the responsibility, but simply delayed its reckoning. She didn't respond with rage. She didn't raise her voice or point a finger or tell him what he already knew. Instead, she pulled from her bag the photograph, faded, creased, and yet still vivid in its intimacy, and placed it gently on the table between them. The image of a younger Lancaster kneeling beside Victor, his hand resting with unmistakable tenderness on the dog's head, his eyes not wary or cold but open, warm, human. And then she placed beside it the order, the one with his signature, the one that turned that same creature into a risk, a file, a disposable object to be relocated with discretion. "I didn't come here to hurt you," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I came here to remind you." There was silence again, but this time it was not cold or defensive. It was the silence of something beginning to unravel, something long buried being drawn back to the surface by the presence of someone who refused to let it remain hidden. Lancaster looked at the papers, and for a long time he didn't speak. But when he finally raised his eyes, not to her but to Victor, there was something different in them, something not yet fully formed, but trying. A sorrow he didn't know how to name. A guilt too large to fit into words. "I couldn't protect him from them," he said, "and when it was over, I told myself it was better that he disappear, that he not remember." Victor stood, not quickly, not abruptly, but with the slow, deliberate weight of someone who had heard the words they had waited years to hear, not because they believed in apologies, but because recognition, when it comes late, still matters. And then, to the shock of everyone but Lily, Victor stepped forward. He crossed the room, slow, silent, steady, and stopped in front of Lancaster, who remained frozen in his chair, watching with a breathless stillness as the creature he had once erased returned, not with anger, but with presence, with dignity, with the unspoken grace of one who had already forgiven what had never been admitted. Victor rested his head gently on Lancaster's knee, and everything broke. In the stillness that followed, thick with everything unsaid, yet resonating with the soft, undeniable sound of something that had once been shattered, beginning, however cautiously, to reassemble, did not interrupt the silence that bloomed in the space between a man and the animal he had once cast into darkness, because she knew, with the instinct of someone who had walked the length of a broken story and arrived at its final, trembling edge, that this moment was not hers to command, but his to meet, and Victor's to offer. Lancaster, his hand still hovering in the air as though uncertain whether to reach or retreat, lowered it slowly until it rested on Victor's head, not with the hesitation of guilt, nor the arrogance, but when it's finally allowed to be seen again for what it was, something real, something full, something once whole and now returned, not to be erased, but to be honored. He did not speak. He did not cry. But Lily saw it nonetheless, the soft collapse of something rigid within him, the surrender not to forgiveness, but to the understanding that some losses cannot be reversed, only acknowledged, and that sometimes the most powerful act a person can make is not to rebuild, but to stand still long enough to let what was lost come back to them, if only for a moment, in the form of a creature who still remembered the better parts of them. Later, when they left the building, not escorted, not dismissed, but allowed to go as they had arrived, with no fanfare, no explanation, just the quiet imprint of what had passed between them, Lily felt no triumph, no sense of victory, but something quieter, something that settled deep in her chest like the closing of a chapter that had waited far too long to find its final page. Victor walked calmly at her side. He did not look back. He didn't need to, because what he had come to retrieve was never a home, or an apology, or even a name. What he had come for was closure, and now, finally, he had it. In the weeks that followed, life did not return to what it had been because it couldn't, not after everything that had been seen, spoken, felt, carried, but it did find a new rhythm, one shaped N. The weight of Victor's head on her lap during quiet evenings, the warmth of morning sun through the window as they sat together in stillness, the knowledge that she had done something most people never dared, not because she had to, but because she couldn't not. And that, more than anything, became the heartbeat of her days. Not justice in the way the world measures it, not headlines or statements or dramatic reckonings, but the quiet certainty that, once upon a time, she had been chosen by a creature who had once been forgotten by the world, and together they had brought each other back. If this story moved you, if you felt, even for a moment, the quiet power of being seen, the weight of loyalty, or the strength it takes to stand beside someone when the world has turned away, then let it stay with you, not just as a story, but as a reminder of what truly matters. Because out there, in corners we often overlook, there are countless silent stories of animals, of people, of moments that almost vanish, waiting for someone to notice, someone to care, someone to choose kindness when it's easiest to walk away. So stay curious, stay open, Be the person who doesn't turn away. And if these stories resonate with you, if they echo something inside you, then subscribe to our channel, because there's more where this came from, more truth, more heart, more of what the world needs. Sometimes, one story really can change everything.